Let's talk about dynamics compression. There are two main kind of directions I think of when I'm thinking about how I want to use dynamics compression on a track or in a piece. One is, am I going more for a creative decision, a creative choice, where I'm trying to enhance the sound in a way that alters it or changes it for to enhance a musical decision that I'm, or a musical emphasizing it or de-emphasizing it for creative reasons? Or am I trying to simply help a piece that's overly dynamic kind of fit into the mix, which I think of as being slightly more utilitarian? Am I helping shape and hone the shape of something simply so that it kind of gives the perception within the context of the rest of the recording, the rest of the mix, that it fits its place? And this is the more utilitarian direction. They don't have to be opposed. They don't have to be. They're on the same kind of continuum. One is just more of a direction, and one is more of another direction, but they're not exactly completely opposed. You can make creative decisions that are utilitarian, and you can utilitarianly do things for creative reasons. So it's just a way of thinking about how you're approaching it. And then the next thing, since dynamics compression is something that happens over time, this is again kind of a mind map of the process, the thought process that I use to approach dynamics compression. Am I thinking about smoothing out the overall dynamics level over the course of the piece, or am I trying to make things poke through in in tiny little increments? Like each hit is going to start poking through, or there's going to be small moments where something is loud and then it's not loud, it's quiet, and loud and quiet. And so one of the reasons for making this video is because I think when people have a lot of questions about compression, it's because it can do so many different things. So we're going to move from simple concepts to more advanced concepts, intermediate concepts, and then more advanced concepts. But you'll see over and over that faster attacks on your compressor settings are going to smooth out that the initial transient. You're going to, as soon as the sound is coming in, or immediately, or the math of it gets a little complicated, but that you're in a fast way, you are often reducing something so that when you gain it later, it ends up feeling smoother, so that you're making the beginning not as loud, so that it doesn't poke through as much, so that it's smoother. And conversely, the reason you would slow your attack down would be so that you let a transient through. And this is all really common advice, and I'm going to get to something more interesting in a little bit. But if you want like a drum hit to have that very initial transient, that very initial start sound loud, then you slow down the attack of a compressor so that it doesn't begin or it doesn't squash the transient. It lets it through. So all of that's really common advice, and probably is well known to most of the people watching this video, but it makes me think through how I came to know what fast and slow is. And so you begin to start thinking about time. Dynamics compression is happening over time. So how many milliseconds, or fractions of a millisecond in some cases, are you letting those transients through for? Is it, you might think, is it 1 second, 5 seconds, 10, 100, 150 milliseconds? What are you letting through? How slow are you letting transients through? So then you start, this is where it can be more creative, it can be more utilitarian, but your brain, once the concepts of fast and slow start settling in, you begin needing to train your brain into feeling thousandths of a second to some extent, so that you begin understanding what these transients actually are taking up in terms of the duration of time. if it's a bass, if it's a kick drum, if it's a softer sound, um, you know, you've got to think through how much you're letting through, or if it's a timpani or another percussion instrument, what is it that you would be letting through before you might start wanting the compressor to actually clamp down on the dynamics. And again, moving through in a mind map kind of way, there's a point at which in today's production world you wouldn't even use a compressor for some of this stuff anymore. Some people are turning away from compressors because there's these transient enhancers, and if they just want their attacks to poke through, you just turn up the transient enhancer, and maybe you turn down the sustain and turn up the attack, and you're done with it. You don't need a quote-unquote compressor anymore. And some people won't ascribe to that. That's fine. But there's an interesting spot here where learning about compression to achieve that transient enhancement isn't necessarily necessary anymore. I mean, it's an academic. So why wouldn't you just use a transient enhancer more and more? There's no reason I'm going to tell you not to. But what I have been thinking about, because I've been using transient enhancers now for a while, is the deeper and more mysterious concept of dynamics control over the full piece. So this comes into play most with very dynamic recordings. Maybe you've got a vocalist who intentionally or unintentionally has a very wide dynamic range. The unintentional reasons might be plosives with pop filters and p and d, making big loud dynamic sounds unintentionally at times, or just getting loud at some section of a song, or loud for only high notes. There's other reasons, loud intentionally and unintentionally. Or you might have a string patch where if you play quietly, it's very quiet, and if you play loudly, it's very loudly, but you really want them kind of controlled more. You want to have that part sit in the mix with, maybe it's a cello or something, be not those different articulations sounding, that it was a loud bow stroke or a quiet bow stroke, but in the mix they're not that different apart. They're not worlds apart dynamically in that section of the piece. You're just accessing different samples in your sample library. Or it might be a bass or a bass synth, something that you need to kind of keep control of and keep steady through most of the piece. A lot of analysis has gone into pop songs and classical songs and jazz songs that have been hits over the years. The level of bass tends to stay the same, while as the piece nears its conclusion, high frequencies have been introduced, and it's gotten a little bit more high frequency heavy. So maybe just controlling your bass through the course of your piece is your goal. So then I think of different ways of controlling dynamics, and I immediately think, well, am I going to approach it with a single band or a multi-band approach? So single band is easy to understand, but there's so much energy in low frequencies. I often am choosing more and more frequently to go for multi-band so that I can compress the lows more than I'm compressing my highs. And when I say lows, I'm kind of talking sub, actually. I'm thinking somewhere below 100 hertz, 120 hertz, into the 60, 50, 40, 20 hertz range, where it's lows into the subs region. Because I want to maybe take a lot of that energy out of the recording, but I don't necessarily need a single band to be compressing all of that and stealing some of the highs out of that channel or track as well. So as soon as I start thinking about single band and multi-band, I also realize, well, if I just want to, take some lows out, maybe I should just put an EQ before the compressor. And so this goes to the interrelationship between, as we get into the more advanced concepts of dynamics compression, is do you even want to compress some frequencies, or do you just want to take them out of the signal before they even hit the compressor? So maybe you want to put a low shelf on something before it even hits the compressor, just in an EQ, just a static shelf that's removing some of those low frequencies. Or maybe you want to just shape the instrument before you're compressing it so that as it hits the compressor, it's compressing kind of a representation of that you already want for that instrument. And then you'll notice that there's more and more products coming out, plugins coming out, where an EQ is appearing within the compressor. I mean, it's not new, but I'm seeing them more and more where you can do pre EQ, post EQ, kind of within the dynamics compression tool itself, where you're choosing, if it's a pre EQ, you know, to maybe you're boosting frequencies and EQing the resultant sound, sending that into the compressor, or maybe you're carving out a band of frequencies that you want to boost or reduce so that the compressor does or does not touch those as much, which is the same thing. They're just it's still an EQ before if it's pre, but you're just they're giving you more of those options to think through as you're making those decisions. And of course, there's EQs that have dynamic EQs, so you can pick a band, a shelf, or a band pass and boost and cut only when those frequencies are present and past a threshold. And we haven't talked about thresholds at all because this is more about taking a large view of why compression tends to be such a big topic, why dynamics compression tends to be cause so many questions, and you know, I just wanted to. This video has no audio. It's all talking about just these brainstorming of concepts. So the other and I want to get a bit of a dialogue or a conversation started, because when people ask questions and they're confused, often there's just so many different aspects to dynamics compression that it's worth just getting an overview of all the different topics to think about. So one of the last things I wanted to touch on is the concept of color, and the idea that some people are going to want their dynamics compression to be what we call transparent, or you know, often that means seemingly transparent. Obviously, if you're doing something, it's not completely transparent, but they don't want to affect maybe the underlying timbre of the sound too much. They basically just want to control dynamics or relative loudness over time. And so the things that are usually, there are two things that usually contribute to color, as I understand it. You know, you might be adding frequencies, low frequencies or high frequencies, so either hum or hiss, that's emulating old analog gear, and adding maybe a low frequency hum, we would call it, or a 60 cycle or 50 cycle hum, 50 hertz hum, kind of might help in some cases. Some people believe that it helped with adding a little body maybe to the sound, and just sort of for whatever reason, you know, contributed to some of the recordings that we all know and love. And then there's also this idea that a little hiss or a little high frequency can, when it's compressed with the sound, can add a little sheen or gloss or smoothness or silkiness. And so some high frequencies mixed in with your compression are part of this colorization. But the other, perhaps more standard concept of color is saturation. And one of the best examples of color in compression is tape saturation, where you know, you're trying to use magnetic particles on a piece of tape and metal to reorient these magnetic particles so that they resemble this sinusoidal based sound, this signal that's oscillating, trying to create this sound. And by rearranging these magnetic particles, you can't do it at a certain point when you're pumping so much. I don't want to get too much out of my depths, but when you're turning it up louder, the particles can only rearrange so much, and the electronics prior to the particles aligning can only you know, operate within certain thresholds, and they begin squaring off the wave. So you've got this sinusoidal wave, and it begins rounding into a square at the top. And you've probably all seen it. So most people, if you've gotten this far, might already know more about saturation than I do. But the topic here about color is that you can either be altering the sound by kind of what we call pushing it, or sort of squaring off the wave and cutting it off in a soft way, by saturating it, or by adding a low level of frequency, either with hiss or hum. And, we also want to mention that compression in buses and groups can help marry sounds together if they're performed well together, presumably, and they're in time together with each other. They can begin sounding more ensemble, more as though they were played together if they weren't, or, drums and bass, if they're mixed well and performed well, begin, marrying in times that there's a kind of give and take between kicks and bass guitar, or low drums and low orchestral instruments, and that all of that kind of begins to zoom way back out from dynamics compression into the concept of what is the mix and EQing the mix, as well as the musicianship. But it all leads to this mysterious concept of glue, and this is probably the most mystifying aspect of dynamics compression, is how do I get glue in my mixes? And, again, I'm not going to claim to be the expert. I'm making this video because I want to generate a bit of conversation and talk about the fact that the reason that there's so many questions about compression is because, there's a lot of aspects to it. But once you've presumably removed some of the masking between your low frequencies, for instance, or even your mids or highs, where we call it slotting, where different parts of your mix are quote-unquote slotted, or at least kind of fit together like puzzle pieces, so that that different frequency ranges are taken up by different parts, and they have a nice balance, and that the range of frequencies is well represented without kind of instruments clobbering each other and kind of getting buried. That's kind of what masking tends to mean in more of a casual explanation. If you've teased apart those parts and they're mixed well together, and then they get compressed in a nice way with maybe a little color, and maybe a little, maybe it's a little saturation, maybe it's a little bit of the hum or hiss, depending on who's doing it and what they're working with and what they like hearing. Then there might be this fine line that you've been able to manage that can contribute to this concept of glue, or a lot of people think of it as a little bit of body, a little bit of the idea that the compressor has helped, often in the mid-lows, lows, kind of help make it feel like it was all played at the same time if it was played separately, or that they're all that you transcend out of the pieces into a unified whole, and you kind of lose yourself in the piece, and you begin forgetting that, the technical aspects of everything and just enjoying the music. You can easily ruin it if you try to push things too hard, or if it's not there, you tend to miss it. It tends to feel a little sterile, or there's maybe just not the vibe. Now, glue doesn't necessarily, you can glue highs together as well, perhaps. There's highs that can feel very stray in a mix and outside the world. But, we mentioned earlier about dynamic EQ, and how one of the most important dynamic EQs is a De-Esser. Well, there's also mastering de-essing tools that you might use on a full mix or on a bus that just soften some of those transients that are maybe making a digital mix sound a little brittle, and you can get some more of that analog softness by de-essing with a mastering de-esser. Some more of that kind of softness in the sibilance of the drums, or hi-hats, or cymbals, or synths, or guitars, and that effectively is a multi-band dynamics compression to help control things. Some of them are transients, and they're working very quickly because it's very high frequencies. And Let me know what you think in the comments. I don't know if this type of a broad conceptual video is helpful, but when I found I wanted to start discussing any of these things in isolation, I felt it was very separated from the broader concept. And every time I thought about one of these concepts, I thought it was a disservice to it to not begin broadly and then kind of reduce each of the pieces of it into different applications, because dynamics compression can be done in so many different ways. It seems more thoughtful to start from a big picture of all the different ways dynamics compression might be used, and then zoom into what am I trying to do in this, on this channel, on this part, on this piece, in this, piece of music or podcast for that matter. What am I trying to do, and then begin to understand the underlying principles that go into achieving that end. Hope you enjoyed it. Thanks.